Hey y'all, it's Megan from Made for Mermaids, and today we are working on a Veronica Teddy. In this video, I am sewing the unlined cups with the thong back and the faux corset back. If you want to see a video of lined cups with a cheeky back and the straight back version, then I will link it down below. The first step is going to be to sew your cups. And what we're going to do is take one center cup and one side cup, and you're going to baste picot on the seam right here, because the picot is going to go in the middle and it's going to get sewn into all of the seams. So we're going to baste the picot first. This is just so it's easier to work with. You can go ahead and just put them together and sew, but it is a little bit more difficult. So I like to baste quickly the picot on the seam. And if you need a video on sewing picot elastic, I'll leave it down below. So you don't want to pull the picot on these seams too tight, but you do want it taut so it's not floppy. It's just going to be providing some support at the seam and then also some really fun pops of color. Okay, and then we're going to put our two pieces together. And you should have a little notch on your cut pieces, so match that notch. And then you'll match the bottom. And then match the top. And then you'll just ease the rest into place. They're opposite curves, so you do have to ease it in, but they should match fairly easy. There's not a lot of extra fabric, it's just the opposite curves that you're easing in. Okay, like that. And now we're going to sew this seam with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Okay, now you do want to pull that basting seam. If you don't, when you put it on, you will definitely hear that pop. So I like to make sure to pull all of the basting seams out. Oops, I got some of the picot there. Okay, so now you can pull the seam apart like this. Now we're going to top stitch this seam, and you can either press it towards the center or towards the side. You just want to make sure whichever one you do, you continue throughout the entire pattern. You can also grade the seam down. The seam isn't so thick. Okay, so now that that's trimmed down, going to press the seam and go ahead and top stitch it in place using a stretch stitch. Okay, there we go. Now you're going to do the same thing with the other cup, and then we need to finish this center front cup. Again, you could trim this here. I'm using very thin fabric, but if you're using something a little thicker, I would take the time to trim that. And then we're just going to turn and top stitch. Okay, now I'm going to repeat that with the other cup. Okay, now that your two cups are sewn together with the picot and the front center is finished, we're going to set those aside, and you're going to grab your front center piece, and we're going to start assembling the side panels. So the first thing we're going to do is baste picot on each side, because again we are putting picot in all of the seams. Okay, so I have my picot basted on each side of that front center panel, and now we're going to sew the side panel on each so it has a notch, and you will match the notches and then match the top and bottom edges. And then again, these are opposite curves, so then you will ease the rest into place. Again, same as the cups, this shouldn't need a lot of stretching or fitting. They should just ease right in together. Okay, so now we will stitch these together and then repeat on the other side. Okay, now let's pull that basting stitch. Okay, now again, I'm gonna go ahead and trim the notches and then grade down this seam. So when you go to top stitch this, you want to double check that your elastic is facing the same way. So if you did this one this way, it would be opposite of the cups. So you want to make sure you're going to be going the same way. And I'm gonna go ahead, again, this is more important if you're using thicker fabric, but I'm gonna grade this seam down on the side panel. Okay, now let's top stitch that picot. Again, double check with your cups that it is going the same way. Okay, so that's one side done. Now we'll do the other side. Okay, so now we have the panels sewn onto the front, and we're going to sew the side seams together on the bottom. So this is the back, the bottom back, and you're going to place it right sides together on one side, and then same with the other side, right sides together, and we're going to sew these together with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Okay, now you can trim down the seam if you want, and then we're going to open it and press the seam towards the back side and top stitch on each side. Okay, now our bottom is all put together, and we're gonna set this aside while we finish our top portion. So you're going to take your upper back piece and put it right sides together with the side cup, and you should have notches to align like that, and you do the same thing on the other side. And now we'll sew this together with a 3/8 inch seam allowance, press it towards the back side and top stitch just like we did the side seams on the lower portion. Okay, so now we have our upper portions all done, our cups with our upper back, and then all the lower portions are sewn together. And now it's time to put the top and the bottom pieces together. So with the right sides together, you're going to align all the picot and the seam. So this is why it was important to sew them the same direction. So I like to start with the picot and then move to the side seam and then the edges. So make sure that your seams are together. And then we'll move to the edge. Okay, and you see that matches perfectly. If your seam allowance was a little off, or these fabrics are very delicate and so can move while you're cutting, if it's a little off, that's okay. Just very lightly ease your pieces together. Now for the center, you're going to align it just like that, going on an angle. And then again, very gently ease the pieces together. So we have one side pinned, and you're going to repeat with this other side. Again, I always start with that elastic. And the side seams. And then the back. Okay, when you get to the center, they're going to very slightly overlap, just the center pieces, because this one's going this way, this one's going that way. So they'll very slightly overlap each other. Okay, everything is pinned. I do like to move this bottom pin so it's not sandwiched. And now you're going to baste this together just to check to make sure all of your seams are lining before you go ahead and sew it. I'm going to baste it real quick, and then After you baste it and check, you're going to sew it with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Okay, once you baste it, there we go, and you're happy with it, everything's aligning, then go back and stitch it. Okay, once you have them sewn together, you can pull those basting stitches. And it's time to sew your underbust elastic. So what you're going to do is press, and you can finger press or use an actual iron, your seam down towards the body. This. And you're going to grab your underbust elastic. And you want this to be about an inch shorter, so I'm laying it out on the seam, and there it is, and I'm going to trim about an inch because you want this to just be a little snug, not too tight. And I'm going to find the center of my elastic, and you're going to pin it on the center, right on top of that seam. That. And now we're going to go find the edge and pin the edge. Again, there's the seam. You're pressing it down, and your elastic is going on top of the seam, just like that. Pin the edge, then pin this end. Okay. And now if you want, you can baste the elastic on the seam, or you can baste this seam down, or if you're having trouble keeping this seam, you could use a little basting spray or a little glue stick to help keep the seam down. I just go slowly and make sure to press the seam like this before sewing. So I'm going to sew the elastic now. So you can see it just stretches just a little bit, not too much, just a tiny bit. So you can flatten the seam and then pull that elastic taut and start sewing. Do the same thing. And you, again, you can baste or pin the elastic if you want. Oh no. Okay, after refilling my bobbin, I finished stitching the underbust elastic. And now it's time to finish this corset back edge. So you will finish each side with picot here. Okay, now that back edge is sewn. Before I stitched the picot down, I did trim the underbust elastic from the seam just so it wouldn't be as thick. And now we're going to sew our back seam. So you're going to align this top edges, and we're going to stitch from where we stitched the picot all the way down to the bottom of the thong. And we're going to stitch with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. You can baste it if you'd like to make sure your elastic lays together nicely. There you go. So from here all the way down. Okay, now you can grade the seam down, especially where the elastic is, and we're going to press the seam towards one side. I'm trying to get where you can see. There we go. Press the seam towards one side, it doesn't matter which, and top stitch it in place. If you don't want to trim the whole seam, I would at least trim this part up here with the elastic so it's not too thick when you go to stitch it down. Okay. Now that back seam is all stitched, and now we can finish this underarm seam, the upper back and the armhole area right here. So I do like to go ahead and mark a little bit lower my strap marking on the back because you're about to sew on top of that. And now you're going to use picot to finish this top seam all around here. And I do like to go over just a little bit on both sides, so when I flip it, I wrap the tail under so it gives it a nice finished edge. Now again, you can grade the seam. You definitely want to trim your elastic as best you can. There's not much up here to trim, but so it's not too thick. And when I am going to trim, see there's just a little bit extra fabric behind the elastic. I don't like that. I'm going to trim that. And you could again trim that all the way back from the seam line. So now when I flip my picot on these two ends, I just tuck that tail back like that, and same on this side, I will just tuck the tail back like that. Okay, and then I'm just going to trim a little bit of that elastic so you get a nice finish there, and replace pin. repeat on this side. Okay, so that upper back and armhole are all finished. And now we're going to baste your lining onto the front. This is the wrong side of your front panel, and you're just going to baste. Or you could use some basting spray if you have it, the lining onto the front piece. Now it's time to finish your leg line with your picot. So you can either cut it to the size and pin it on, or you can just do it by hand, which is normally what I do. You don't want to stretch it along most of the crotch lining until about an inch under the lining, until on the thong you get to the back, because you want this area to be tight and hold snug, and then you don't want the area at the bottom of the thong or at the bottom of the front crotch to be too tight, so you just want that to be 1-to-1, and then stretch it along this leg line. Okay, make sure to trim off any excess fabric along the seam line or along the leg line. Or if you're using a thicker fabric, you can trim the entire seam. I like to get the elastic so it's not too thick when you flip it. Okay, one leg line down. Now I'm going to do the exact same thing on the other side. Okay, now both leg lines are done, and it's time to stitch the crotch together. So with right sides together, we'll just align the elastic and raw edges, and you're going to stitch with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Then we're going to trim back the elastic from the back side and press the seam towards the back and top stitch. Okay, and the last step is to sew our straps. If you want to see a video on how you make the adjustable straps, I will link it down below. Okay, so now it's time to stitch our straps. So here is their strap piece. On the front, you're going to put your strap directly under that seam, and you're going to overlap it by about 1/2 inch. And I'm going to do 2 lines of stitching here and here to hold that strap in place. And then on the back, make sure your strap isn't twisted. We're going to do the same. You're just going to overlap the ends a little bit by about 1/2 inch. And you're using the marking on your pattern piece for the guide, and you will do 2 lines of stitching to hold it in place. Do the same thing on the other side. Okay, and the final step is to do the corset loops or the faux corset. If your picot has the little holes, the easiest way is to just slip your elastic through the holes of the picot and then try the teddy on. And once you try it on and you get the faux corset as tight as you like, then you will tack the elastic down on the edge. Let's see, 1, 2, 3. I'm gonna go every 4. Make sure that's even. 4. Or you can leave the loops long and you can just tie it each time. If your picot doesn't have loops, then you can make fabric or elastic loops. And that's all in the tutorial. So I did not calculate this out. I just decided to go every 4 loops all the way down. You could go more or less if you wanted it tighter or looser. And so I'm not going to tack mine down yet, but I'll show you what I mean. So you want to try it on to make sure that you don't have this too tight or too loose. And you could, if you want, again, pull these through the front and just tie the ends. But what I like to do is once you're happy with the width, and you could just you could even just knot these like this to try on so it doesn't move. And then once you're happy, you would tack the elastic right on the picot just like that a few times on each side to hold in place. And then your teddy is complete. If you have any questions, you can, as always, leave them down below and I will try to answer them. If you make a teddy, we would love to see it in our Facebook group or tag us on Instagram at Made for Mermaids. And I can't wait to see what you make. Bye.